The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of Afghanistan's Kunar province as Commander Sarah Chen led her SEAL team through the treacherous mountain pass. The year was 2011, and the war had been raging for a decade. Sarah was one of the few female commanders in the elite Navy SEAL units, having fought tooth and nail to earn her position in a world dominated by men. Her team consisted of 8 highly trained operatives, each hand-picked for this critical mission. Intelligence had indicated that a high-value target, a Taliban commander responsible for numerous attacks on coalition forces, was hiding in a compound nestled deep within the mountains. The mission was supposed to be straightforward: infiltrate, capture, or eliminate the target and extract safely. Sarah checked her watch as they approached the designated overwatch position. The plan was meticulously crafted. Alpha Team would provide sniper support from the ridge, while Bravo Team, led by Sarah herself, would assault the compound. Everything had been rehearsed dozens of times back at base. They knew every entrance, every potential escape route, and every contingency plan. As they settled into their positions, Sarah's radio crackled with updates from Alpha Team. "Overwatch in position," came the voice of Sergeant Martinez, her most trusted sniper. Target building confirmed. Multiple heat signatures detected inside. Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came before every mission. This was what she lived for, what she had trained her entire career to do. The compound below looked deceptively quiet. A few goats wandered around the courtyard and smoke drifted lazily from a chimney. But Sarah knew better than to trust appearances. The Taliban were masters of deception, and this compound could be crawling with fighters waiting to spring a trap. She had lost too many good soldiers to underestimate the enemy. Her team moved with practiced precision down the rocky slope. Each member knew their role perfectly. Corporal Johnson would breach the main door, while Petty Officer Williams covered the rear exit. Sarah would lead the charge into the main building, where intelligence suggested their target was hiding. The operation was scheduled to take no more than 15 minutes from start to finish. As they reached the outer perimeter of the compound, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. The intelligence reports had mentioned 3 buildings, but she could clearly see 4 structures. The 4th building was partially hidden behind a cluster of trees, invisible from their original observation point. This discrepancy troubled her, but they had come too far to abort the mission now. She made a quick decision to split her team. Half would proceed with the original plan, while she and 2 others would investigate the 4th building. It was a calculated risk, but Sarah's instincts told her that something important was hidden in that unexpected structure. Her years of experience had taught her to trust those instincts, even when they contradicted the official intelligence. The assault began at exactly 0600 hours. The sound of the breaching charge echoed across the mountains as Johnson blew the main door. Sarah's team moved swiftly toward the mysterious 4th building, their weapons ready and senses heightened. The morning air was crisp and clear, carrying the scent of wood smoke and mountain pine. As they approached the hidden structure, Sarah noticed fresh tire tracks in the dirt. Vehicles had been here recently, and the tracks were too large to belong to the old trucks typically used by local farmers. These were military-grade vehicles, possibly American Humvees. The implications sent a chill down her spine. If the Taliban had captured American vehicles, it could mean they had also taken American prisoners. The building itself was larger than it had appeared from a distance. What she had initially thought was a small storage shed was actually a substantial compound with multiple rooms. The walls were thick concrete, reinforced with steel beams. This was not a typical Taliban hideout, but rather a sophisticated facility designed for long-term occupation. Sarah signaled for her team to take positions around the building. Through a small window, she could see movement inside. Shadows flickered against the walls, suggesting multiple occupants. She tried to get a clearer view, but the windows were covered with heavy curtains, making it impossible to determine how many people were inside or whether they were armed. The sound of gunfire erupted from the main compound as her other team engaged the enemy. Radio chatter filled her earpiece with urgent status reports. The Taliban fighters were putting up fierce resistance, and the mission was not going according to plan. Sarah realized they had walked into a much larger operation than intelligence had suggested. Her attention was suddenly drawn back to the building in front of her when the door burst open. 3 Taliban fighters emerged, armed with AK-47 rifles and moving with military precision. These were not the usual untrained militants they typically encountered. These men moved like soldiers, suggesting they had received professional military training. Sarah and her two teammates immediately took cover behind a low stone wall. The enemy fighters had not yet spotted them, but it was only a matter of time. She could hear more movement inside the building, indicating that additional fighters were preparing to join the battle. The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. Through her radio, she heard the urgent voice of Sergeant Martinez from the overwatch position. "Commander, we've got multiple vehicles approaching from the east. Looks like reinforcements. You need to extract immediately." Sarah's heart sank as she realized they were about to be surrounded. The mission had become a trap, and her team was caught in the middle of it. But even as the situation deteriorated around her, Sarah's mind remained focused on the mission. Somewhere in that building might be American prisoners or crucial intelligence that could save countless lives. She had not come this far to retreat without at least attempting to complete the objective. The decision she made in the next few seconds would determine not only her fate, but the fate of her entire team. Sarah made the split-second decision that would define her career. Instead of retreating, she decided to press forward with the assault on the mysterious building. She knew the risks, but her gut told her that whatever was inside was worth the danger. Years of training had prepared her for moments like this, when everything hung in the balance. She signaled to her teammates, Corporal Davis and Petty Officer Thompson, to flank the building from both sides. The Taliban fighters outside were still unaware of their presence, giving them a brief tactical advantage. Sarah counted down from 3 on her fingers, and simultaneously, all 3 SEALs opened fire. The engagement was swift and decisive. The Taliban fighters, caught off guard by the surprise attack, fell within seconds, but Sarah knew this was just the beginning. The gunfire would alert anyone else in the area, and she could already hear shouts coming from inside the building. Time was running out. Davis kicked in the door while Thompson provided cover. Sarah was the first through the breach, her rifle raised and ready. The interior of the building was darker than expected, lit only by a few small windows. As her eyes adjusted, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Along the far wall were 3 American soldiers, bound and gagged, sitting on the floor with their backs against the concrete. They were alive, but clearly had been prisoners for some time. Their uniforms were torn and dirty, and they showed signs of rough treatment. Sarah's heart raced as she realized they had stumbled upon a prisoner of war situation that intelligence had completely missed. But before she could reach the prisoners, movement in the shadows caught her attention. 2 more Taliban fighters emerged from a side room, their weapons already trained on the captured Americans. The lead fighter, a bearded man with cold eyes, shouted something in Pashto while pointing his rifle at the nearest prisoner. The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Sarah could see the finger of the Taliban fighter tightening on the trigger. Without hesitation, she took the shot. The fighter dropped instantly, but his companion managed to get off a burst of automatic fire before Thompson eliminated him. The sound of gunfire in the enclosed space was deafening. Sarah rushed to check on the prisoners while her teammates secured the rest of the building. The 3 Americans were members of an army patrol that had gone missing 2 weeks earlier. They were dehydrated and weak but alive. Sarah quickly cut their bonds and gave them water from her canteen. The eldest of the prisoners, a sergeant with graying hair, grabbed Sarah's arm. "There's more," he whispered urgently. "They've got intelligence files in the back room. Documents about upcoming attacks. You have to get them." His eyes were filled with desperation and fear. Sarah knew she had to make another difficult decision. Her primary mission had been to eliminate the Taliban commander, but now she had rescued American prisoners and discovered crucial intelligence. However, the sound of approaching vehicles was getting louder, and her radio was crackling with increasingly urgent messages from her overwatch team. "Commander, you've got company incoming fast." Martinez's voice crackled through her earpiece. "Multiple trucks, estimated 20 to 30 fighters. You need to move now." The situation was deteriorating rapidly, but Sarah couldn't abandon the intelligence that might save American lives. She ordered Davis to help the prisoners while she and Thompson searched the back room. What they found exceeded their expectations. The room was filled with maps, photographs, and documents detailing planned attacks on coalition bases throughout the region. There were also laptops and communication equipment that could provide invaluable intelligence about Taliban operations. As Sarah stuffed the most important documents into her pack, the building shook from an explosion nearby. The Taliban reinforcements had arrived and were attacking her main team at the primary compound. Through the windows, she could see muzzle flashes and smoke rising from multiple locations. The situation had become a full-scale battle. Thompson grabbed one of the laptops while Sarah continued gathering documents. Every piece of intelligence could potentially save lives, but they were running out of time. The sound of gunfire was getting closer, and she could hear Taliban fighters shouting orders in the distance. One of the rescued prisoners, a young private who couldn't have been more than 20, was struggling to walk. He had clearly been injured during his captivity, and his left leg was barely supporting his weight. Davis was doing his best to help him, but moving 3 weakened prisoners through hostile territory would be nearly impossible. Sarah's radio exploded with chatter. Her main team was under heavy fire and requesting immediate backup. Sergeant Martinez reported that enemy fighters were attempting to flank their position, and ammunition was running low. The carefully planned extraction route was now completely compromised. As they prepared to leave the building, Sarah heard the distinctive whistle of an incoming rocket-propelled grenade. She threw herself over the injured private just as the explosion rocked the building. Debris rained down from the ceiling and dust filled the air. When the smoke cleared, she saw that part of the roof had collapsed, blocking their planned exit route. Thompson was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, but he was still functional. Davis had protected one of the other prisoners and was checking him for injuries. The building was structurally damaged but still standing. However, they were now trapped with limited options for escape. Through the hole in the roof, Sarah could see Taliban fighters positioning themselves around the compound. They had effectively surrounded the building, turning their rescue mission into a siege situation. Her team's ammunition was limited, and they had 3 wounded prisoners to protect. Sarah assessed their options quickly. The front entrance was certainly covered by enemy fighters. The back exit led directly into an open courtyard where they would be sitting ducks. The hole in the roof might provide an escape route, but it would require climbing while under fire and carrying injured prisoners. As she weighed their choices, one of the prisoners, the sergeant who had told her about the intelligence, managed to stand despite his injuries. "There's a tunnel," he whispered. They dug it to move supplies. "It leads to a cave system about 200 meters north." He pointed toward the back of the building where a heavy wooden crate sat against the wall. Sarah and Thompson quickly moved the crate, revealing a narrow tunnel entrance barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. It was their only chance, but it meant abandoning most of the equipment they had gathered and moving through unknown terrain while being pursued by a superior force. The sound of footsteps on the roof above them indicated that Taliban fighters were attempting to enter through the damaged section. Sarah made the decision that would determine whether they lived or died. They would take the tunnel, carrying only the most critical intelligence documents and fighting their way to freedom through the underground passages that might either save them or become their tomb. The tunnel was even more cramped than Sarah had anticipated. The rough-hewn walls scraped against their equipment as they crawled forward in single file. Sarah led the way with her flashlight, followed by the injured private, then the other 2 prisoners, with Thompson and Davis bringing up the rear. The air was stale and thick with dust, making it difficult to breathe. Behind them, they could hear the Taliban fighters breaking into the building they had just escaped. Angry voices echoed through the chambers above, and Sarah knew it wouldn't be long before their pursuers discovered the tunnel entrance. Every second counted now. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly through the rocky mountain. Sarah's knees were raw from crawling over the rough stone floor, and her shoulders ached from the cramped position, but she pressed forward, knowing that stopping meant death for all of them. The rescued sergeant had warned her that the tunnel system was complex, with multiple branches and dead ends. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, they reached a junction where the tunnel split into 3 different directions. Sarah stopped and consulted her compass, trying to determine which path led north toward the cave system the prisoner had mentioned. The wrong choice could lead them deeper into the mountain or directly into enemy hands. The sergeant, despite his weakened condition, crawled forward to join Sarah at the junction. "The middle path," he whispered, his voice hoarse from dehydration. "But be careful. They have the tunnels booby-trapped in some places. We saw them setting up explosive devices during our captivity." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Moving through an unknown tunnel system was dangerous enough without the added threat of improvised explosive devices. She would have to watch for tripwires, pressure plates, and any other signs of hidden dangers. One wrong step could kill them all. As they entered the middle tunnel, Sarah moved even more cautiously, using her flashlight to scan every inch of the path ahead. The beam revealed scratches on the walls where equipment had been dragged through, confirming that the Taliban had indeed used these passages regularly. After another 10 minutes of careful progress, she spotted the first trap. A thin wire stretched across the tunnel at knee height, almost invisible in the darkness. Sarah traced it with her light and saw that it was connected to a small explosive device wedged into a crack in the wall. She carefully marked the location and showed the others how to step over the wire safely. The knowledge that they were walking through a minefield made every movement terrifyingly deliberate. They encountered 2 more booby traps as they continued through the tunnel system. Each time, Sarah managed to spot the danger and guide her team safely past. But she knew their luck couldn't hold forever. The Taliban had years to perfect these traps, and there might be devices that were too well hidden for her to detect in the limited light of her flashlight. The tunnel began to slope upward, suggesting they were approaching the cave system. Fresh air started to circulate, carrying with it the scent of pine trees and mountain air. Sarah felt a surge of hope that they might actually escape this underground maze alive. But as they climbed toward the surface, new dangers awaited them. The sound of voices ahead made Sarah freeze. Someone was talking in the cave above them, and the language was definitely Pashto. The Taliban had discovered their escape route, or worse, they had been waiting for them all along. Sarah turned off her flashlight and signaled for complete silence. In the darkness, they could hear footsteps moving around the cave entrance. Sarah faced an impossible choice. They could retreat back through the tunnel system, but that would mean facing the booby traps again in reverse, and they might encounter Taliban fighters who had followed them from the building. They could try to wait in the tunnel until the fighters above moved on, but the injured prisoners were weakening, and time was not on their side. The third option was to fight their way out, but they would be emerging from a confined space into an unknown cave, where the enemy held the tactical advantage. With limited ammunition and 3 injured prisoners to protect, the odds were heavily stacked against them. Sarah weighed each option carefully, knowing that the wrong decision would mean death for her entire team. As she considered their choices, one of the prisoners began to cough quietly. The sound echoed slightly in the tunnel, and Sarah saw the man's face twist in panic as he tried to suppress the sound. But it was too late. The voices above had stopped, and she could hear movement as the Taliban fighters investigated the source of the noise. A flashlight beam suddenly appeared at the tunnel entrance above them, sweeping back and forth as someone searched for the source of the sound. Sarah knew they had been discovered. There was no more time for planning or careful consideration. They would have to fight their way out or die in this underground tomb. She whispered quick instructions to her team. Thompson would go first, using the element of surprise to eliminate any fighters near the entrance. Davis would help the prisoners reach cover while Sarah provided covering fire. It was a desperate plan with little chance of success, but it was their only option. Thompson crept forward as quietly as possible, his rifle ready. Sarah could see his silhouette against the faint light from the cave entrance. The voices above were getting louder as more fighters gathered to investigate the tunnel. Sarah counted at least 4 different voices, possibly more. Just as Thompson reached the entrance, the injured private behind Sarah had another coughing fit. This time there was no hiding the sound. Immediately, automatic weapons fire erupted from above, and bullets ricocheted off the tunnel walls around them. Thompson was forced to take cover just inside the entrance while muzzle flashes lit up the cave like deadly fireworks. Sarah made a split-second decision that would define the rest of the mission. Instead of following the original plan, she would create a diversion that might give her team a chance to escape. She pulled out her last grenade, knowing that using it in the confined space of the tunnel would be incredibly dangerous for all of them. But before she could execute her plan, something unexpected happened. The sound of helicopter rotors echoed through the mountains, growing louder by the second. Sarah's heart leaped with hope as she recognized the distinctive sound of American Blackhawks approaching their position. But her relief was short-lived when she realized that the helicopters might not know about their location in the cave system. The Taliban fighters above were also aware of the approaching aircraft. Sarah could hear them shouting orders and moving equipment. Some were probably setting up anti-aircraft weapons while others might be preparing to use the prisoners as human shields. The situation was becoming more complex and dangerous by the minute. Through her radio, which was finally picking up signals now that they were closer to the surface. Sarah heard the voice of her extraction team. They had received her distress signal and were inbound for emergency pickup. But the landing zone they were heading for was the original extraction point, miles away from the cave system where Sarah's team was now trapped. Sarah realized that she would have to make contact with the helicopters and guide them to her new location while simultaneously fighting her way out of the cave. It was an almost impossible task, but the arrival of air support had given them their first real chance of survival since the mission had gone wrong. Sarah keyed her radio while bullets continued to ricochet around the tunnel entrance. Eagle Base, this is Alpha 1. Emergency extraction needed at grid reference. She rattled off their approximate coordinates based on her compass readings and estimated distance traveled through the tunnels. The radio crackled with static and she wasn't sure if her message had gotten through. The helicopter sounds were getting closer, but Sarah could also hear the distinct whistle of rocket-propelled grenades being fired at the aircraft. The Taliban had indeed set up anti-aircraft positions around the cave system. Explosions echoed across the mountain as the pilots maneuvered to avoid the incoming fire. Thompson called back from the tunnel entrance. "Commander, I can see about 6 fighters positioned around the cave mouth. They've got good cover behind rock formations and at least one of them has an RPG launcher." The tactical situation was becoming clearer, but it wasn't encouraging. They were outnumbered and outgunned, trapped in a tunnel with limited escape routes. Sarah made another critical decision. She would have to split her focus between coordinating with the helicopters and fighting their way out of the cave. She handed her radio to the rescued sergeant who, despite his injuries, was the most alert of the 3 prisoners. "Keep trying to raise Eagle Base," she whispered. "Tell them we're in a cave system approximately 200 meters northeast of the original target building." The sergeant nodded and began attempting to make radio contact, while Sarah prepared for the assault on the cave entrance. She had 2 fragmentation grenades left, limited ammunition for her rifle, and a sidearm with 3 magazines. It wasn't much for a prolonged firefight, but it would have to be enough. Davis had positioned the other 2 prisoners in a small alcove about 10 meters back from the entrance, where they would have some protection from ricocheting bullets. The injured private was barely conscious, and the 3rd prisoner, a corporal with a broken arm, was doing his best to help support his wounded comrade. The sound of helicopter rotors was now directly overhead, and Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of a Black Hawk's miniguns firing. The pilots had found the Taliban positions and were engaging them from above. This was the opportunity Sarah had been waiting for. While the enemy fighters were focused on the aerial threat, she could launch her assault on the cave entrance. "Now!" she shouted to Thompson, and both SEALs burst from the tunnel entrance simultaneously. The cave was larger than Sarah had expected, with multiple chambers and natural rock formations providing cover. 3 Taliban fighters were crouched behind rocks firing up at the helicopters, while others had taken positions to guard the tunnel entrance. Sarah's first shots took down the fighter with the RPG launcher, eliminating the primary threat to the helicopters. Thompson engaged 2 fighters who were positioned to his left, while Sarah rolled behind a large boulder to avoid return fire. The cave echoed with the sound of gunfire, making it difficult to determine exactly how many enemies they were facing. The helicopters above were providing crucial support, but they couldn't fire directly into the cave without risking hitting Sarah's team. She could hear the pilots on the radio, trying to coordinate with ground forces and identify friendly positions. The rescued sergeant was doing his best to provide their location, but the radio was cutting in and out due to the interference from the rock formations. As Sarah reloaded her rifle, she heard movement behind her. A Taliban fighter had flanked around through another tunnel entrance and was attempting to get behind their position. She spun around just in time to see the muzzle flash of his AK-47. The bullet passed so close to her head that she could feel the heat, but her return fire was accurate. The fighter dropped immediately. Thompson called out from across the cave. "Commander, I count at least 4 more fighters in the back chambers. They're trying to set up a defensive position deeper in the cave system." Sarah realized that the Taliban were planning to draw them into a prolonged underground battle where the helicopters couldn't provide support. But then Sarah heard something that changed everything. The injured private, who had been barely conscious, was calling out weakly. "Commander," he whispered when she reached him, "the tunnel behind us. It connects to their ammunition storage. They've got explosives back there." Enough to bring down the whole mountain? Sarah's blood ran cold as she understood the implications. The Taliban weren't just planning to fight them in the caves. They were prepared to detonate their ammunition stockpile and bury everyone under tons of rock, rather than let the Americans escape with the intelligence they had gathered. It was a suicide mission, and Sarah's team was caught in the middle of it. The radio suddenly crackled to life with clear communication. Alpha 1, this is Eagle 26. We have your position marked and are preparing for emergency extraction. Can you reach the ridgeline approximately 50 meters north of your current position? The helicopter pilot had found a potential landing zone, but it meant fighting their way out of the cave and up a steep mountain slope while under fire. Sarah looked at her wounded team and the 3 rescued prisoners. The injured private could barely stand, and the others weren't much better. Carrying them up a mountain slope while fighting off Taliban fighters seemed impossible, but the alternative was being buried alive when the ammunition stockpile exploded. She made another split-second decision that would determine their fate. Instead of trying to fight their way to the landing zone with the prisoners, she would send Thompson ahead with the most critical intelligence documents, while she stayed behind to hold off the Taliban fighters and buy time for the evacuation. But as she began to explain her plan to Thompson, the rescued sergeant grabbed her arm with surprising strength. "Wait," he said urgently. "There's another way. The ammunition storage tunnel leads to a vehicle bay. They've got trucks down there, and there's a road that leads directly to the ridgeline where the helicopters can land." Sarah felt a surge of hope mixed with skepticism. Using the Taliban's own escape route seemed too good to be true, but it might be their only chance. However, it would mean going deeper into the cave system, closer to the ammunition stockpile that could explode at any moment. The sound of gunfire was intensifying as more Taliban fighters arrived at the cave. Sarah could hear vehicles approaching on the mountain roads below, bringing reinforcements that would soon surround their position. The helicopters were running low on fuel and couldn't provide support indefinitely. Thompson looked at Sarah with grim determination. "Commander, whatever we're going to do, we need to do it now. I can hear them setting up heavy weapons outside the cave. In a few minutes, this place is going to be a kill zone." Sarah weighed their options one final time. They could try to fight their way to the helicopter landing zone, but that would mean abandoning the wounded and probably getting everyone killed. They could stay and fight in the cave, but that would end when the ammunition stockpile exploded. Or they could trust the word of a rescued prisoner and venture deeper into the Taliban tunnel system, hoping to find vehicles that could carry them to safety. The decision she made in the next few seconds would either save her team or lead them all to their deaths in the depths of the mountain. Sarah looked at the faces of her men and the rescued prisoners, all of them depending on her leadership to get them home alive. The weight of command had never felt heavier than it did at that moment. "We go deeper," Sarah announced, her voice cutting through the chaos of gunfire. "Thompson, help Davis move the prisoners. I'll provide rear guard." It was a calculated risk that went against every instinct that told her to fight toward the surface and freedom. But sometimes the most dangerous path was the only path to survival. They moved quickly through the back tunnel that the sergeant had indicated. The passage was wider here, clearly designed for moving equipment and supplies. Sarah could smell diesel fuel and motor oil, suggesting that vehicles were indeed stored somewhere ahead. Behind them, the gunfire in the main cave was reaching a crescendo as Taliban reinforcements arrived. The tunnel opened into a large underground chamber that took Sarah's breath away. It was a sophisticated logistics hub, carved directly into the mountain. 3 pickup trucks and a larger transport vehicle sat in the center of the space, surrounded by stacks of ammunition boxes, fuel barrels, and communication equipment. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a major Taliban operations center. But what caught Sarah's attention immediately was the sight of several Taliban fighters working frantically around the ammunition stacks. They were attaching wires and electronic devices to the explosives, confirming her worst fears. They were indeed preparing to detonate the entire facility, rather than let it fall into American hands. Thompson spotted the threat at the same time. "Commander, they're wiring the whole place to blow. We've got maybe minutes before this mountain becomes our grave." The fighters hadn't noticed their arrival yet, focused entirely on their destructive preparations. Sarah had to make another lightning-fast tactical decision. They could try to eliminate the fighters before they completed the bomb setup, but any gunfire might trigger an accidental explosion that would kill everyone instantly. Alternatively, they could try to reach the vehicles and escape before the detonation. But that would mean crossing the open chamber under the eyes of armed enemies. The rescued sergeant, despite his weakened condition, pointed toward a set of keys hanging on a hook near the largest truck. "That one," he whispered. "It's armored. Used to be one of yours before they captured it." Sarah recognized the vehicle now. It was indeed an American Humvee that had been modified with additional armor plating. Sarah signaled for Thompson and Davis to move the prisoners toward the vehicle while she created a diversion. She still had one fragmentation grenade left, and she used it to devastating effect. The explosion on the far side of the chamber drew the attention of the Taliban fighters, giving her team precious seconds to reach the Humvee. But as Thompson started the engine, one of the fighters spotted them and raised the alarm. Automatic weapons fire erupted across the chamber, bullets sparking off the rocky walls and the armored vehicle. Sarah dove into the passenger seat while Davis and Thompson loaded the prisoners into the back of the Humvee. The Taliban fighters were now caught between trying to complete their bomb setup and stopping the American escape. Several of them abandoned their work to focus fire on the vehicle, while others continued desperately trying to complete the detonation sequence. Sarah could see the lead bomber working with increasing panic, knowing that his own escape time was running out. Thompson gunned the engine, and the Humvee lurched forward toward a tunnel exit that led upward. But their path was blocked by fuel barrels and ammunition boxes that the Taliban had stacked as barriers. The armored vehicle plowed through the obstacles, but the impacts were jarring, and Sarah worried about the injured prisoners in the back. As they crashed through the final barrier, Sarah heard the distinctive electronic beep of a timer being activated. The Taliban fighter had completed his work and the countdown to detonation had begun. She had no idea how much time they had, but she knew it wasn't much. The exit tunnel was steep and narrow, forcing Thompson to navigate carefully despite their desperate need for speed. The Humvee's engine strained as they climbed toward the surface, and Sarah could hear rocks scraping against the armored sides of the vehicle. Behind them, she could see the glow of muzzle flashes as Taliban fighters pursued them on foot. They burst out of the tunnel onto a narrow mountain road, just as the first explosion rocked the mountain behind them. The sound was deafening, and the ground shook so violently that Thompson nearly lost control of the vehicle. Rocks and debris rained down around them as the tunnel system collapsed, sealing off their escape route forever. But they weren't safe yet. The road ahead was treacherous, winding along the edge of steep cliffs with barely enough room for the Humvee to pass. Worse, Sarah could see Taliban fighters on motorcycles emerging from hidden positions along the route. They had anticipated this escape path and prepared an ambush. The first motorcycle attack came from their left flank. The rider was armed with an RPG launcher, and Sarah watched in horror as he took aim at their vehicle. She grabbed her rifle and leaned out the passenger window, taking a desperate shot just as the fighter fired his rocket. Her bullet found its mark, but the RPG was already in flight. Thompson yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, sending the Humvee dangerously close to the cliff edge. The rocket exploded against the rock wall behind them, showering them with stone fragments but leaving the vehicle intact. Sarah's ears were ringing from the explosion, but she could still hear the sound of more motorcycles approaching. 2 more riders appeared ahead of them, blocking the narrow road. Thompson didn't slow down. Instead, he accelerated directly toward them, using the Humvee's superior weight and armor to his advantage. The motorcycle riders were forced to dive off the road to avoid being crushed. But one of them managed to throw a grenade that exploded near the rear of the vehicle. The explosion damaged the rear armor and shattered the back window, but the Humvee kept moving. Sarah could hear one of the prisoners crying out in pain, hit by flying glass, but there was no time to stop and provide medical care. They had to reach the helicopter landing zone before more Taliban reinforcements arrived. The road began to level out as they approached the ridgeline where the helicopters were waiting. Sarah could see the Blackhawks in the distance, their rotors spinning and ready for immediate takeoff. But between them and safety lay the most dangerous part of their journey, an open stretch of road with no cover where they would be completely exposed to enemy fire. As they approached the final stretch, Sarah's radio crackled with an urgent message from the helicopter pilots. Alpha 1, be advised we have multiple enemy vehicles approaching your position from the south. You've got about 2 minutes before they reach the landing zone. The race was on and it would be close. Thompson pushed the damaged Humvee to its limits as they raced across the open ground. Behind them, Sarah could see a convoy of Taliban trucks in pursuit, kicking up clouds of dust as they closed the distance. The helicopters were already beginning their approach, but they would need time to land and load the passengers. Just as they reached the landing zone, disaster struck. One of the pursuing Taliban vehicles was equipped with a heavy machine gun, and the gunner found his mark. Bullets tore through the rear of the Humvee, and Sarah felt the vehicle begin to lose power. Steam poured from under the hood as the engine took critical damage. The Humvee coasted to a stop just 50 meters from where the lead helicopter was touching down. They would have to cover the remaining distance on foot, carrying the wounded prisoners while under heavy fire from the approaching Taliban forces. Sarah knew this would be the most dangerous part of their entire escape. Sarah kicked open the passenger door as steam continued pouring from the Humvee's damaged engine. "Everyone out! Move to the helicopter!" she shouted over the sound of rotor blades and incoming gunfire. The Black Hawk had landed about 50 meters away, its crew chief already running toward them with a stretcher for the most seriously wounded prisoner. Thompson and Davis each grabbed one of the rescued prisoners, while Sarah supported the injured private who could barely stand. The young soldier had lost a significant amount of blood during their underground ordeal, and his face was pale with shock. But his eyes were alert, and he gripped Sarah's arm with determination. The open ground between the Humvee and the helicopter felt like a mile as they ran across the rocky terrain. Taliban bullets kicked up dirt around their feet, and Sarah could hear the distinctive crack of rounds passing close overhead. The helicopter's door gunners were returning fire, their M240 machine guns laying down suppressive fire against the approaching enemy vehicles. Halfway to the helicopter, the injured private stumbled and nearly fell. Sarah caught him and realized he was losing consciousness from blood loss. Without hesitation, she lifted him in a fireman's carry, despite the fact that this made her a larger target for enemy snipers. Every step felt like it took forever as she struggled across the uneven ground with the wounded soldier on her shoulders. Thompson reached the helicopter first and helped load his prisoner into the cabin. Davis was right behind him with the second rescued soldier, but Sarah was still 20 meters away when she heard the sound that made her blood freeze, the distinctive whistle of an incoming mortar round. The explosion landed just 10 meters to her left, showering her with rocks and dirt. The blast wave knocked her off balance, but she managed to keep her footing and continued toward the helicopter. The private on her shoulders was unconscious now, and she could feel his warm blood soaking through her uniform. "Commander, move faster," the crew chief shouted from the helicopter door. "We've got multiple mortar positions bracketing our location." Sarah could see the truth of his words as more explosions erupted around the landing zone. The Taliban had called in indirect fire support, and they were walking their shots closer to the helicopter. Just as Sarah reached the helicopter, she felt a sharp pain in her left leg. A bullet had found its mark, tearing through her calf muscle and sending her sprawling to the ground. The injured private rolled off her shoulders, and for a moment, Sarah thought they were both going to die just meters from safety. But Thompson was there instantly, grabbing the unconscious prisoner and dragging him into the helicopter. Davis reached down and hauled Sarah to her feet, supporting her weight as they stumbled the final few steps to the aircraft. Blood was flowing freely from her leg wound, but she was still mobile. As they climbed into the helicopter, Sarah heard a sound that filled her with dread. The second Black Hawk, which had been providing air support, was calling out a mayday. "Eagle 26 is taking heavy fire. We've lost hydraulics and are going down." Through the open door of her helicopter, Sarah could see the other aircraft smoking and struggling to maintain altitude. The pilot of Sarah's helicopter didn't wait for further instructions. The engines roared to maximum power, and they lifted off just as another mortar round exploded exactly where they had been standing seconds before. Sarah watched through the door as Taliban vehicles converged on the landing zone, their occupants firing wildly at the departing aircraft. But her attention was immediately drawn to the second helicopter, which was indeed going down. The pilot was fighting to control the damaged aircraft, trying to find a safe place to land on the rocky mountainside. Sarah grabbed the radio from the crew chief and tried to establish contact with the downed crew. "Eagle 26, this is Alpha 1. What's your status?" The response came back immediately, tinged with urgency. "Alpha 1, we're going down hard. Engine failure and hydraulic loss. We've got 4 souls on board, including your Sergeant Martinez from the Overwatch team." Sarah's heart sank as she realized that Martinez, her most trusted sniper, was on the crashing helicopter. She had served with him for 3 years, and he had saved her life more times than she could count. The thought of leaving him behind was unbearable, but she knew that their helicopter was already overloaded with wounded passengers. The damaged Black Hawk disappeared behind a ridge line, and Sarah lost visual contact. On the radio, she could hear the pilot's final transmission. Eagle 26 going down. Landing coordinates follow. Then there was only static. The helicopter had crashed somewhere in the hostile mountains, and the crew was stranded in Taliban territory. Sarah's pilot came over the intercom. "Commander, we're critically low on fuel and carrying maximum weight. We need to reach the nearest forward base immediately or we won't make it at all." Sarah understood the implications. They had enough fuel to reach safety, but not enough to mount a rescue mission for the downed crew. As they flew toward the American base, Sarah stared out at the rugged mountain terrain below. Somewhere down there, Martinez and 3 other Americans were fighting for their lives, possibly injured and certainly surrounded by hostile forces. She had completed her mission. The rescued prisoners were safe, and the intelligence documents in her pack could save countless American lives. But the cost had been higher than she had anticipated. The original Taliban target had escaped during the chaotic battle. Her team had sustained casualties, and now 4 more Americans were stranded in enemy territory. Sarah wondered if the intelligence they had gathered was worth the price they had paid. The injured private she had carried to safety was receiving medical attention from the helicopter's medic. His color was improving, and it looked like he would survive. The other 2 rescued prisoners were stable, though they would need extensive medical care when they reached the base. The mission to rescue them had succeeded, but at what cost? As the forward operating base came into view, Sarah made a silent promise to herself. As soon as she received medical treatment for her leg wound and debriefed the intelligence officers about their findings, she would volunteer to lead the rescue mission for Martinez and the downed helicopter crew. She had never left a soldier behind, and she wasn't going to start now. The helicopter touched down at the base hospital, and medical personnel rushed forward with stretchers. As Sarah was helped from the aircraft, she clutched the pack containing the Taliban intelligence documents. Despite everything that had gone wrong, they had accomplished something significant. The documents would provide valuable insight into planned attacks and help save American lives. But as she was loaded onto a stretcher and wheeled toward the emergency room, Sarah's thoughts were not on her successful mission or her wounded leg. She was thinking about Martinez and the 3 other Americans who were still out there, somewhere in the hostile mountains, waiting for someone to come and bring them home. The mission wasn't over yet. In fact, for Sarah Chen, the most important part was just beginning. The SEAL commander who had thought all was lost when she grabbed the abandoned rifle in that Taliban compound had not only survived but had saved 5 American lives and gathered crucial intelligence. But her story was far from over, and she knew that her greatest test of leadership still lay ahead in the mountains of Afghanistan.